Hi, this is Paul. Last week on the YouTubes, we were treated to a conversation or debate. Each of them sort of pitched it their own way about metaphorical truth, or really just a good conversation between Jonathan Pageau and Stephen Woodford. Stephen Woodford is the creator of the channel Rationality Rules. Now, I'm a pastor, and pastors are both receive confessions, and if we receive confessions, we should take them. I was quite dismissive at a point in my little YouTube career about Stephen Woodford and a bunch of his videos. I was really surprised this happened at all, and my take on him was mostly that he was sort of a fast and cheap debunker and that he wouldn't know anything about Jonathan Pageau. But Stephen Woodford has more than most, let's call them celebrity atheists, Jordan Peterson's term, more than most has really kept up with Jordan Peterson. I mean, I noticed not long ago he continued to make these videos about Jordan Peterson even when Jordan wasn't making videos, and I thought that was a rather strange thing. Well, apparently he's been listening to the videos that he's been debunking, and those have sunk in, and I really appreciated his posture, the way in which he approached this conversation, and I'm happy to make this confession, and I'm more happy to be wrong. So good for you, Stephen. I hope this conversation continues, and it's really caused me to reassess his project in a whole new way. Having said that, I think many of the people, including myself, felt a degree of disappointment at the end of this video because, like so many attempted conversations of this kind, there was a lot of talking past each other that happened. Now, part of the reason my channel looks the way it does is because as a pastor, I know it takes a while for people to find each other. What do I mean by that? If you'll notice, I don't do a lot of celebrity interviews. Part of the reason I don't is because, especially the first time I talk to them, I want to take a couple of hours and I want to get into their story, because it's way too easy to simply project onto other people our own biases and preconceptions, and that makes it very, very difficult to really understand the people's arguments. Now, gosh, this gets into a whole bunch of things even before I get into the video. What we tend to see on YouTube are chattering heads where people are making arguments. And again, back to all the cognitive science we've been talking about for the last 3 years, we have to filter these things. And so when we see Stephen Woodford or Jonathan Pageau, Woodford, I have to say his name properly, Woodford or Jonathan Pageau, if you find my first videos where I used to butcher poor Jonathan's name, we simply project a whole bunch of things onto them, which may or may not be accurate, which may or may not be fair. And what tends to happen if we sit down and take a half hour or an hour to just get into someone's story, we build up empathy, we subtly recalibrate how we approach them, even if they are, in a sense, our rivals or adversaries in a tribal dispute, or even just a friendly tribal reassessment. We don't treat them or their ideas fairly. And so that's why when I do conversations, and if Stephen ever wants to be on my channel, I'd happily have him. I'd like to spend an hour just talking about his life, where he grew up, the kind of home he grew up in, his experience with religion. I mean, all the conversations that I've done on my channel before. And if you look at my first conversation with Jonathan Pageau, it was the same thing. And I'm happy to be subject to that interview by anybody as well, if they're curious about where I came from. I'm a pastor, and so part of what I've known with people is you're not going to be able to really build the kind of warm, emotional, friendship might be too strong a word, but just a generous regard with a person until you sort of know where they're coming from. And that's especially important if the person is sort of on the other side of an ideological or religious divide, or even just a philosophical or theological divide. And this is why when there are conflicts and issues, we're far better off talking to each other face to face and understanding each other's stories so that we see each other as, to a degree that we can, far more 360-degree human beings. Okay? And so I've been in, especially in this conversation with Jonathan Pageau, who over the last 3 years I've got a chance to know at least a bit. Jonathan and I have never met face to face, but I certainly have a great deal of affection for him. So I was really impressed by this. Now, part of those of you who follow my channel, my exhaustive hours of video, which obviously many people have no hope of ever catching up on and probably shouldn't spend their time doing it. The atheist-Christian debates are really an exhausted trope. And part of the reason they're an exhausted trope is a lot of the stuff that I've gotten into over the last few years in God Number 1 and God Number 2, the video I did a while ago, belief in God is not the key difference between Christians and atheists. And actually, this conversation between Jonathan Pageau and Stephen, I don't know if he's like Stephen or Stephen Woodford, is I thought an amazing example of my point that belief in God is not really the difference. A lot of it has more to do with actually the conception of God. As I've mentioned on my other videos, the most common conceptualization of the Christian God by many is that God is another thing. And this comes up, actually, this becomes really the defining moment of this conversation, I think, that God is a super thing that somehow lives out in the universe someplace or in another dimension, and Christians access this super thing by prayer and other rituals, and the super thing can intervene in history. But it's again, with a lot of my videos, it's really addressed by the ancient Hebrews and brought into the modern world by Ezekiel Kaufman in terms of his understanding of the way the God of the Hebrews differed from the other pagan gods with respect to a metadivine realm. The metadivine realm is the thing in which the gods of the ancient world live. And this is, of course, why the God of Christianity differs from Zeus or Thor or any of these other gods. And this is a subtle but pervasive point. And if you find some of the better conversations between much more rigorous philosophical theologians, they'll often make this point, but it's a difficult point, and one, again, that goes over the head of many Christians. And so it's hard to blame atheists for conceiving of God in this way. It's really a product of centuries of development, critical of which is obviously the rise of deism. Christianity's historic conceptualization of God. Many Christians assume a mostly materialist framework and append a God to it. And it tends to be this God that the celebrity atheists usually don't have too much difficulty debunking. And many will acknowledge that you can't really prove a negative that this God doesn't exist, but you can certainly seem to address the ways in which the expectations of people who are trying to engage this super thing by obedience or prayers or things of this nature that, well, does your super thing really work out well for you? All you have to find is someone who it didn't work out well for in terms of their expectations, and boom, you've made enough of your point that you can say, what good is your God if your God doesn't show up? Now, obviously, this was an issue in the pagan world as well, but again, the real issue is not really is God or isn't God out there. It's much more how we conceptualize this idea of God. And again, part of what I think Jordan Peterson did from a psychological perspective simply showed that God is, in a sense, a a potent imaginative variable in our, using again Charles Taylor's language, in our mental imaginaries, that it's this conceptual, the idea of God is simply too useful to do without if you want to construct a productive and peaceful and, well, civilization, the kinds of which many of us who are listening to this video in the West have grown to appreciate and desire. So again, what went wrong in this conversation? Basically where many such conversations tend to flounder. Many such conversations are doomed from the start. How we see the world is dependent upon our perspective. And this, of course, is the dominant thesis of postmodernity. Not necessarily a new thesis that, well, the world you see is dependent upon the place that you're standing to see the world. And the world looks different from different perspectives. So Pageau is remarkably a non-dual atheist in his perspective. Now, I know that's going to really excite some of you that I use that term, but he is. And the longer I listen to him, the better I think I understand him, the more clearly that is, the more clear that comes to me. Stephen aspires to a non-dual materialism. In other words, they both have, in a sense, competing non-dualities. And there's not a lot of room for these competing non-dualities. And so finding enough common ground between them is going to be no easy thing. The kind of sort of late-stage adaptive Protestantism that most atheist debunkers address has an element of dualism in it. There's sort of the world and God. Now, again, subtly, the God is sort of imagined to be within, let's call it being. And so God is another being within being. And so then, again, the question is either, is that God out, is that super thing, that super being out there or not? And even if you can assert that the super being is out there, if the super being is unreachable or unrelatable, then what point is the super being in your life, and what point does the super being what point is there having this super being engaged in our world in a public way? And again, this is very much the framework of modernity, which very much comes on the heels of the rise of deism in post-Enlightenment Europe, and in many ways is built into the fabric of the grand American political experiment, and many of the achievements of that political experiment were copied in one way or another throughout the West. And so this is deep, deep in our imaginary and in our social structures. Now, Pageau has a very different perspective on this. Jonathan understands the particular conceptualization of non-dual materialism. And I think when I look back on what first attracted me to Jordan Peterson was, in a sense, to get rid of another dualism that I saw in the church, which was sort of an insular, isolated biblicism within the church, where on Sunday we would go and we would read Genesis 1, and we would imagine, well, here we are reading Genesis 1, that the world is sort of flat on a tabletop, and there's pillars below, and there's a firmament above. And then we go out into the rest of the world, and we see, the earth rise over the moon, and we conceptualize the sun, the planets as balls going around. And so in many ways, what caught my attention from Jordan Peterson is, okay, how can we address this? And this is why I had been reading C.S. Lewis's book Miracles over and over again to try to address non-dual materialism that was always sort of making inroads into my thinking. How can we put these two worlds together? So there are a lot of different kinds of dualisms, and when I say non-dual theism, it's basically, you see, that gets really tricky because there are a lot of non-dualities out there, more than two. And so here really you have the conflict between the non-dual theism of Pageau and the non-dual materialism of Stephen. Now, Pageau is difficult for many of us to understand. And I remember when I first started listening to Jordan Peterson, very quickly in comment threads, Jonathan Pageau's name would come out, and I heard he was an Orthodox icon carver. Now, I had been noticing in my own church circles increasing affection and attraction to sacramental theological traditions within Christianity. I had noticed a lot of younger clergy coming up and looking in some ways a little covetous at Anglican, Orthodox, and Roman Catholic ideas and especially rituals. The ancient modern, of course, had its rise in the wake of the seeker movement in terms of church practice and ecclesiology. And so I started listening to Jonathan Pageau, and when I first started listening to him, I had a very difficult time understanding what on earth he was talking about. Now, the insights he was offering with respect to a symbolic interpretation were quite impressive, and to the degree that they sort of lined up with some of the conservative culture war stuff that was sort of fueling Peterson's rise. It's easy to see why you could get attracted to Pageau, but the more you listen to him, the stranger and stranger it became. And his theological guiding lights were, Ephraim the Syrian and Maximus the Confessor, people I had never heard about. These seemed like sort of B-team church fathers. And of course, I had a little bit of introduction to church fathers in my Protestant Dutch Calvinist seminary, but really not nearly enough. And so it takes a while, especially for a Protestant, to sort of understand where Pageau is coming from. Now, most atheists are sort of post-Protestant in many ways. What that means is they've sort of moved through sort of the psychologizing of the Protestant Reformation into the split world deism, where, well, there's a creator God out there and he sort of establishes morality to a degree and ushers in the creation, but then the world pretty much runs on its own. And the whole conceptualization of nature that C.S. Lewis nicely talks about in Miracles, of that which runs on its own. In other words, it runs on its own. There's no mind or consciousness guiding it. There's no purpose that's guiding it. And really the next stage after deism was, well, if God is so far out and unreachable and we can't actually relate to him and he's not paying any conscious attention to us, then what good is he? And of course, The Origin of the Species, middle of the 19th century, at that point, many just sort of cut the ties with God completely, whereas Voltaire and many before the 19th century sort of maybe kept God in the wings. You'll find that in the deist founders of the American, the American democracy. At some point, God becomes useless, and, well, he's just sort of ignored and jettisoned. And really only a few people would come after God in the way that post 9/11, the new celebrity atheists did. And they came after God really for political reasons. And Stephen is very much in that tribe, as this video recognizes. So these two are really coming at each other from very different worlds. Now, it's pretty clear to see the tenets of non-dual materialism. This is, in many ways, the majority public posture of the West and has been for a long time, especially with respect to public spaces, science, technology, and education. This has been the secular worldview, the secular frame in many ways, and I think as Tom Holland pretty convincingly demonstrates, is in fact sort of a second, I like to call it a second secret sister of the church. Secularity in this way is actually historically dependent upon Christianity, and we can see that in places like India and the Islamic world, where they are very quickly desecularizing themselves. We see this in certain New Age corners as well. Now, this gets into the whole atheism plus business, which we won't go too far into, but the tenets of non-dual materialism basically go like this. And there are a variety of different evolutions of this, as my conversations with J.P. Marceau and John Vervaeke have been pointing out, because J.P. Marceau has really been keeping up on this stuff. And he just wrote another piece about miracles, which is something I'll want to engage in a video, but not for right now. So the universe we experience is a product of physical emergence from below. And Jonathan Pageau tried to bring in some of the emanation emergence conversation, which has sort of been the way our conversations with John Vervaeke have gone, especially now with J.P. Marceau in the mix. And the universe we experience is a product of physical emergence from below. One can account for everything we know and think by virtue of purposeless processes that have yielded this physical world. Physis goes on its own to grow, as Lewis points out in his book Miracles. This physical world and the psychological processes we experience that are dependent upon it. Now, Lewis characterizes this in his book Miracles as the whole show, and there's an element to that. But now, obviously, if you look at, let's say, John Vervaeke's physicalism, there's things that are self-organizing, self-developing, that try to get away from some of the determinism that you'll find in the likes of Sam Harris. But the process is this. It's a non-duality. It comes from below. Obviously, the Achilles heel of this is something that Jordan Peterson and many others have noted, which is this really only works once the laws, again, we're knocking on deism's door. The laws of physics are established. Once these laws of physics are established and things sort of go on their own, the Big Bang gets things started, but you can't really get beyond the Big Bang. So it's, give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest. One comment in Jonathan Pageau's posting of this: in the beginning, evolutionary psychology created the heavens and the earth. The difficulty, of course, is that if you take away the laws of physics, you take away this physis, this growing, this nature, this things going on their own. And basically the argument would be, well, we can't get beyond that, but for everything else, we can sort of imagine that it just sort of happened on its own. But the key thing, again, is this is Darwin's contribution, and you can read that in the Metaphysical Club, is that there's no purpose to this. There's no consciousness with a telos defining the trajectory, reaching an outcome, and all of these things. Well, we're highly evolved primates, and just the way physics and chaos, and as things rolled out, this is the way it would be, basically following the laws of physics. Now, there's a meaning crisis hidden in here, since purpose is not in the world from the start. Purpose is something we project onto the world, and this is sort of the emergence that comes up. We develop consciousness in order to adapt and be superior over beings that are less conscious and don't have all the faculties for it, and all of these things develop. Values are therefore telic. They have a telos, they have an end, they have a goal, they have a purpose, that we evaluate something based on whether or not it's moving us closer or getting further what we want. And there's actually a really nice part in the conversation here where Stephen gets into this.
And that's one of the reasons why it'll be hard for you to understand too, like how much I speak out of my Christian position, because I know where I stand. Like, I know where I am. I am in this story. I am in the Christian story. I am in the Christian, I participate in the pattern in an active, real way. And so when you tell me that we need to apply different patterns or choose different patterns because the reality underneath has changed, my question is, where are you? Like,
okay, now this will be something that, again, I think will frustrate listeners, because they keep trying to make the same point back and forth throughout this video. And the point that Jonathan is making is, where is your telic yardstick in terms of how you can evaluate? You've got the fact-value distinction here. How you can evaluate good, bad, right, and wrong. You talk about metaphorical truth being, well, we actually find this story like the porcupine can't can throw its quills, or that there's bad air. And so because they thought that the plague was spread by bad air, people would go out to the country and they would achieve an adaptive advantage, even with a misunderstanding of the actual mechanisms that were at work. Okay. And so now they're debating about this, and Jonathan is going to keep coming back throughout this video to the question of telos. What's your standard? What's your telos? And this is a very interesting interchange, because what Stephen can't give is an overall arching telos, which is obviously what religions provide, but there are instrumental smaller telai that function within the world, smaller goals, smaller purposes, and this is what he's going to lay out basically.
Where do you stand? From which position do you stand that you are able to judge this? And then what then is your purpose? Like, what is your goal? What are you reaching towards? What are you trying to make happen? Because you say good and you say bad and you say better, but I'm not sure I know what that is. Like, I don't know what it means to say that we need to let's say patriarchy is not acceptable anymore. We need to replace it with something else. But I'm not sure, like, what is this good that you see either in the future or in this new pattern? Like, is it more equality? Is it equality? Is it like, I don't know what it is, the good that you're referencing.
Okay, so an answer with a question. I don't think that words such as good and bad, right and wrong, have any intrinsic meaning. The meaning comes from essentially a Kantian hypothetical imperative of the teleological aspects in consideration. It's the
Okay. He threw a bunch of words out there, but basically what he's saying is good, bad, right, or wrong are a function of a telos, a meaning, a purpose, a goal. If you have a goal out there, might be a moral goal, might be a more instrumental goal, good, bad, right, and wrong are all in that way dependent upon the goal. And so because there's no purpose built into the universe, those terms don't really help you so much, apart from their instrumental aspect of moving you towards that goal.
The goals that make it whether or not it's good or bad. So it depends on your goals as to whether or not something is good or bad. So if you see something through the vision of Christianity, you're going to say it's good if it lives up to the expectation of Christianity.
Okay, so you have these things like religions that provide goals, and so something is good if it pushes you towards that goal. Now, Jonathan is looking from Stephen for an overall overarching goal, which he's not really going to provide here, partly because he says, well, we'll get into that.
Lives up to God. If you're seeing it through, say, communism, you're going to say it's good if it is something that emancipates the proletariat and removes power from the bourgeoisie. That's how good or bad works. I'm in the same boat as you. I completely recognize this in the sense that I'm trying to... My intrinsic axiomatic definitions of good or bad are a product of my psychological evolution, the same as you. But
okay, now they're a product of a non-telic blind process. Because again, in a non-dual materialism, it's critically important. The whole point that Darwin makes is that evolution is not telic. Evolution does not pursue a goal. The only goal the creature has is survival and propagation and getting into the future. It's very much a time-oriented goal, but you can't really say that a highly evolved primate like a human being is better than a chimpanzee. Now, you might say better at second-order thinking, imaginative problem solving. Really, one of the key things seems to be both communal language to share with each other, self-restraint. Chimpanzees make terrible pets because they have zero self-restraint. And what people seem to do is be able to collectivize in a much more powerful way all this second order thinking, all of these kinds of things that we do. There's a very interesting book out there. Is it named The Difference Between Us? It basically is making that, it's not that we're so much smarter as such than chimps. It might be a comparison that, we've both got, Core i5s in terms of our brain power, but humanity has Wi-Fi and networking capacities that the chimp, their networking capacities are far more limited than our networking capacities. And then so culture and imagination, this culture track is really what gives us the power that we have to collectivize and to work together and to really conquer and dominate the world. But again, by virtue of this non-dual materialism, there's no purpose built into the system. There's no reason the world is here in the way that we understand reason, or at least in Aristotelian terms, a final cause. Now the goal sort of gets smuggled in from Darwin, and that goal is survival or getting yourself into the future. This gets into some of Brett Weinstein's illustrations about a genocidal spelling bee, that the goal of not only myself as a creature with a high degree of consciousness as opposed to creatures with far lower degrees of consciousness, but even certain enzymes and even a virus, which we would assert has, unless you're a panpsychist, has no consciousness. The goal of the virus is to propagate itself among human beings, and to infect one after another, and this sort of to grow, physis, to go on its own. Now we find it instrumental and helpful in terms of our networking capacity to afford something like a virus agency, but the worldview doesn't really afford the virus agency as such. That's sort of the language that we are left with to try to talk about agency, and so we can't divorce it. But again, I would say the theological assertion is that there is no purpose beyond it. The virus isn't acting on purpose the way, let's say, a human being acts on purpose with the full complement of consciousness. But the whole show, as C.S. Lewis calls it, there is no purpose behind the whole show. There is no purpose for life having developed on planet Earth. There is no purpose with human beings subjugating and eventually eliminating their evolved primate rivals such as Neanderthals. There is no purpose beyond any of this. This is just all sort of running. And this, of course, invokes the dreaded meaning crisis that, the terrific phrase that John Vervaeke has really helped to popularize, and I think something which really helps frame the rise and power that Jordan Peterson sort of stepped into, that suddenly there were thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of people out there who were suffering a meaning crisis, and Jordan Peterson comes along and is able to infuse agency in them, and suddenly their lives are better, they're cleaning their room, their relationships are being restored. I mean, that's really beyond the culture war stuff, which has its own meaning dynamic. The whole thing behind Jordan Peterson was this infusing of certain elements of the Western population with a lot of meaning. It sort of energized and things took off. So there's this meaning crisis behind here. Now, this particular non-dual, let's call it non-dual materialism, struggles with we and should. We simply can't operate in the manifest image without these things. And as C.S. Lewis nicely points out in his book, The Abolition of Man, we have instincts, we have desires, but the problem with instincts and desires are that there are so many of them, and I got to move move my face here. And the problems with instincts and desires is that there are so many of them, and figuring out which should be at the top of the hierarchy at any given moment is an issue. And again, which should be. I can't even say that sentence without using that word. Instrumental towards what? Well, instrumental towards obeying or satisfying this instinct or satisfaction, or instrumental towards, let's say, spreading my seed, my genetic seed into the future, or that's at the culture layer, or at the biological genetic layer, or maybe at the culture layer, spreading my ideas so that my ideas will go. And now this gets very interesting, because ideas are immaterial, but they're sort of acting just like genetics. And so at some point, you're going to have to ask yourself, does this start with ideas and then colonize genetics? Or does this emerge from genetics and sort of colonize the idea world? Because, of course, in a non-dual materialism, the idea world is simply dependent upon there being physical, material creatures to host these ideas. That's essential to the non-duality of non-dual materialism. And some of you who have watched a lot of Jordan Peterson know that in one of his public appearances, might have been in one of the biblical series, might not have been, I don't remember offhand, but someone basically asks him, you know, if God would exist if there were no longer human beings, essentially to host the idea of God. And Jordan sort of equivocates on that. And a lot of that has to do with modernity, with Kant, and with Jung. So there's a lot going on there. Modernity in terms of, well, those are sort of private ideas that you're allowed to hold privately, but are unseemly to bring out in public. And I just read a very interesting piece by a professor at Wheaton, who I think wrote up really quite a helpful piece for me. There have been a couple of good pieces out there that have been sent to me since Jordan has sort of re-arisen in terms of helping to understand Jordan and Jung and their relationship. And that comes through quite clearly in this video as well. But again, we have difficulty with the should and with the we. All throughout Stefan's argument, he's saying we must choose the better. But he has, in this moment, sort of undermined a grand better. There is no better apart from pursuing a goal. Now, okay, I can understand why you have a goal. There are biological instincts and desires and urges that you are trying to satisfy. Those become goals. But on what basis do we have a goal together? Now, it might be that, well, there's a collaboration. If we collaborate, we can both, if I want, let's say, if I want sex and you want money, well, prostitution seems to be in order. So here we go. We can both pursue these goals together. And so human beings we cooperate. And again, another great Brett Weinstein, we cooperate in order to compete. Or sometimes we compete in order to cooperate. And so we're all, this competition cooperation matrix is going. But the should and the we really have trouble living together. Not that they don't, and not that we don't see them and can't understand them and see and tell stories of how they do, but ultimately they don't, because ultimately there is no telos, there is no purpose, and, well, this tends to have its consequences in people's minds. Pageau keeps asking for this, but Stefan really doesn't offer it, and he doesn't offer it because at least at this point he admits he really can't, because underneath there really is one in our culture. And but to sort of say it out loud and to finally be able to justify it and to build it upon non-dual materialism, well, and I'll get into what this is for our culture, it begins to look a little arbitrary. So his anthropology, I think, then comes to the fore. Well, we're these evolved primates. Well, okay, well, where does all this go and how does all this end? What human beings are really are sort of these choosing navigators. Now, again, if you listen to Brett Weinstein, he sort of has a atheist compatibilism going on, and we disagree whether or not these choices are real, or if they themselves are products, as C.S. Lewis says, of the whole show. That all of our desires and instincts have simply been built into us by evolutionary psychology and the genetics and the hormones, and there's no purpose to them. We're just simply running the programs of the successful programming of our past ancestors. And this, in many ways, will set up the big complaint that that Stephen Woodford basically gets from Brett Weinstein, that, well, all of this old code, because we keep tinkering as we develop this code, we keep changing our environment, and we're living in a very different environment than we're finding some unity with past Homo sapiens and pre-Homo sapiens than we had. And again, this is a highly imaginative we. It itself is very much a mental construct than we had back when we were living on the savannah, or in the 18th century, or in the 3rd century, or yada, yada, yada. But human beings are fundamentally choosers. We are navigators, and we make choices based on implicit or explicit instincts or desires to achieve the good which we pursue. So when we're driving down the road, we have all of these brightly colored signs lit up that are promoting sugar and fat for our consumption, because when we, even though none of us as individuals have ever been there, but our biological programming is carrying us forward. When we were out foraging for food, we didn't have a lot of access to fat or sweets. And so now I pull into McDonald's and I get a double quarter pounder with cheese and a chocolate milkshake. And it's just full of fat and sugar, because I have been programmed by my past to pursue these things. Now, being an individual in my mid-50s who has eaten this diet, has a very sedentary lifestyle, even as compared to people who lived just a few hundred years ago, all of this fat and this sugar is not good for me, because I'll live a shorter life because of this. And so you have to go on drugs and have to do all these other things that we don't want to do in order to counteract the old programming. And basically the assertion is that religion is fundamentally the same thing as this. We adapted and created religion. So again, Brett Weinstein, we're two-track. We've got the culture track and we've got the genetic track. We've got all this culture track code that has brought us forward via religion and has helped us in the past, but because, just like the way fast food along highways and at truck stops and at interstate exits here in the United States fools us, so also religion is this old code, and it fools us. And so what we must do now is make rational decisions to say, nope, I'm going to stop at, well, there used to be a chain called Fresh Choice, which is basically a salad bar. And I'm going to eat paleo, which is sort of weird, because what we're doing is we keep monkeying with these contexts. I'm going to eat paleo. I'm going to eat vegan. I'm going to eat one way or another in order to counteract the deceptive coding that's in me. And again, the challenge here is that, well, religion is basically the same coding. But again, notice that all of this is built up on non-dual materialism. All of this has these assumptions built in. This non-dual materialism has, in effect, spawned a whole degree of stories, and the kinds of stories that I've been telling, that I've been getting from Brett Weinstein and others, are all built upon that system. Okay, so it's an entire worldview. Now, I've been talking about religion S, which is sort of this secular perspective on religion, and religion W, which is religion as worldview. Well, this is sort of a religion as worldview. This is the way we see the world. This is the truth that we perceive. Now, this is where, again, where it gets tricky, because we have trouble with we and should. We should together try to help each other achieve our individual goals through systems of freedom and affordance. And I would say this is sort of the kindness telos. What do I mean by that? Well, it's sort of a pragmatic, collectivism, whereby more people can succeed in their individual and communal attempt to secure what they desire. And so, because there's a fair amount of commonality, well, fast food and debit cards and drive-thrus now in the time of COVID, it's good to have a system where lots of people can collectively get the fat and the sugar that they desire. But then we worry because, well, they're getting all that fat and sugar that really isn't good for them. Maybe we should also have a system where there are restraints on the fat and sugar that they desire, because what's happening in the system is that, well, we have like public health care, which both of them have. One's Canadian, one's English. Not so much in America, but to a degree, yes. We have this public health care, and that, in fact, is draining the coffers on all this needless fat and sugar, and all the cows are bad for the planet, and all of the bad conditions for Haitian cane cutters, yada, 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 yada. So maybe we should restrain this. So in other words, we have this vast, complex system that attempts to, in kindness, deploy and afford for individuals a maximum amount of psychological satisfaction as compared to other systems. And that's, in a sense, the implicit telos of the system. Can we deploy, as well as possible, can we maximize the amount of psychological satisfaction in the system overall? But now, we have to pay attention here, because we might look at people and say, this one looks satisfied and this one isn't satisfied. We might have them do a survey and say, this person is more satisfied and this person is less satisfied. There's been quite a bit of happiness studies, but that's sort of the idea. We pretty much have a utilitarian worldview happening under the surface. And when, for example, Brett Weinstein had his conversation with Alistair McGrath was very patient and very kind in listening to Brett Weinstein, and he basically said, sounds like utilitarianism. And I've had a variety of conversations with people, and basically say, well, yeah, the assumption of a good world is that we maximize the degree of psychological satisfaction for as many people as we can. Now, this obviously isn't a new idea, and it was an idea that was played with by, for example, by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World. And it runs into the problem that Jordan Peterson has been pointing out for a while now, that actually happiness isn't a good ultimate telos in terms of what we want. And in many ways, the kindness telos and the happiness telos sort of go together in terms of how we use them. And Peterson makes the point that we regularly will exchange meaning for happiness. People do that. They die for their country. They sacrifice for their children. And in fact, Peterson makes an argument from below that we are more programmed for meaning than we are for happiness. And he goes into this quite deeply with his conversation with Justin Brierley on Unbelievable with Susan Blackmore. And it's a potent point. But now, how do we necessarily handle this point? Because, well, if kindness is the telos, then is it kinder to afford meaning? Well, meaning and happiness are often rather inverted. Anyway, one of the really interesting parts about this conversation was the basic, is it a collapse? Is that unfair? Acknowledgement, surrender on the whole point of truth and evolution. The older position was that, well, sort of a pragmatic thing, that we are evolved to know the truth, and successful competition and truth finding is a successful aspect of successful competition. Now, both C.S. Lewis and Alvin Plantinga pretty much destroy that argument philosophically, and Donald Hoffman in terms of the atheist space has been destroying that argument in terms of evolution. And Stephen Woodford basically completely concedes that entire point, that it used to be argued that human beings could know truth by virtue of trial and error plus rationality. When we found what worked, we knew truth. We evolved into truth, and basically says we don't evolve for truth. We evolve for, now you're going to get into this telos issue. We evolve for survival. And this is, again, he's done a lot of videos on Jordan Peterson's evolutionary or Darwinian truth, sort of debunking it. But in many ways, it's kind of what he's employing here, because we don't evolve to know truth. We don't evolve to know truth, especially propositionally. We evolve to compete and survive and achieve satisfaction. And there are tricks and hacks and all of this. And this, of course, is one of the adaptive explanations of religion. It's also one of the adaptive explanations of how religion satisfies meaning. Religious systems, basically exaptation, use all of the visual, because the visual then gets, sort of stepped up into the imaginary, and then all of our story capacity gets used to afford meaning to our lives, which basically give us a buffer against suffering. And human beings with meaning can endure a great amount of suffering. So the relationship between truth and evolution has pretty much gone out the window. And again, C.S. Lewis made that point. Alvin Plantinga makes nearly the identical point in his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. Basically, it seems like the celebrity atheists are, for the most part, simply conceding. The difficulty they're going to have is that once you concede on this evolutionarily, you're going to have to ask yourself scientifically if science actually affords truth either. And Thomas Kuhn and the history of scientific revolutions, I mean, that door is getting knocked at too. In other words, skepticism is moving up the feeding chain. Well, evolution would afford truth. No, evolution doesn't afford truth. It affords meaning and adaptation and communal, but it doesn't afford truth, because religion is, displayed to be an adaptive advantage. Now, again, religion, both S and W. But will this threaten science itself? No, because what we're doing in science is we have really these tiny little correspondence mechanisms and these tiny little physis connections that if we do this, we get this outcome. We do this, we get this outcome. But again, that's in the matterverse. All right. The conversation begins with metaphorical truth. And he uses, and it was good to have another example of metaphorical truth, which is bad air, and talked about how, and I don't think this is a particularly helpful illustration. What this really shows is simply low resolution, because air, well, what was air? Air, wind, spirit, that's where it sort of operated in the conceptualization. And obviously, as the scientific revolution progressed, they had more and more ways of discovering that air wasn't just spirit, wind, air, ruach, pneuma. Air wasn't just spirit, air was this substance, and that there could be things in the air. And obviously, when we got to the germ theory, there's more and more things in the air, and there's oxygen in the air, and there's nitrogen in the air. And so air, really the conceptualization of air changed dramatically. But his point was that even without the germ theory of infection or an understanding of viruses, the idea of bad air, which again I think is just sort of a low resolution compared to the higher resolution things we're dealing with today, people who were avoiding bad air, well, had an adaptation, had an adaptive advantage over those who were in bad air. And, if you walk into a place and it reeks of urine or feces or some other smell, we naturally get out, even if we don't know what the compounds are. Then we went back to the porcupine throws its quills. Now, I want to do some work on C.S. Lewis's miracles and some of these things because, again, notice when we say throw, when we talk about throw, we think of picking up something in our hand and throwing it this way. nobody ever imagines porcupines go like this and throw. What do we mean they throw their quills? Well, they don't really throw their quills. Jonathan comes back with a very interesting response, and he argues that most religious traditions don't emphasize the sort of scientific cause and effect with respect to their prohibitions, which is, again, he's making a generalization, and you can easily find in the Bible certain exceptions to that. One of them in the Ten Commandments: honor your father and mother, that you may live long in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Now, if you listen to my sermon, I just recently preached the Ten Commandments, there is actually sort of a cause and effect that one might say, and this is sort of a just so story that we see with a lot of evolutionary things. If children are raised watching their parents care for the grandparents of the children, that gets imprinted on the children as good, bad, right, or wrong. And so if it's the duty of the parents to care for their aging parents, then children will then grow up and follow in the footsteps of their parents and care for their own parents when they age. In other words, there could be an adaptive advantage right there built into the fourth commandment. Honor your father and mother, that you may live long in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. It's right there built into the commandment. As the Apostle Paul says, this is the first commandment given with a promise. If you do this, you will then get that. But as Jonathan Pageau mentions, most of the prohibitions, and again, prohibitions on same-sex sexuality, weaving linen and wool, eating shellfish, these are not put into a cause and effect relationship. They are put into an interpersonal, relational, covenantal relationship, where in many ways the cause and effect are delayed or not necessarily direct, as we see in sort of a scientific pursuit of reality. It doesn't say that if you eat shellfish, you will die of poison or anything like that. It's that eating shellfish is a violation of the covenant. Well, what is the violation of the covenant? And again, we might better understand some of these prohibitions. Let's say that you have a spouse who believes that listening to 80s music is an offense against all of reality because no good music was made in the 80s. And so if you get caught, and so your spouse tells you, you shall not listen to 80s music, and then you get caught listening to 80s music, well, suddenly you're in real trouble because you have sort of violated the terms of the covenant. This very much gets into the relational exaptation, personal relationship aspect of the God of the Bible. And that is a much more interesting conversation, I think, and a whole conversation for another video. But Pageau makes the argument that when we're hearing these prohibitions, we're not really doing science. And in some ways, some of Jonathan's symbolism, how shall we say it? Some of Jonathan's symbolism concordance arguments, which is in a lot of ways what some of his symbolism arguments are, is that, well, there's a natural impact to doing this. That's the way, now again, for Jonathan, that's the way nature plays out. And if you want to understand how that works in Jonathan's mind, and what's interesting to watch people listening to Jonathan, hearing him do this symbolism concordance arguments, they're hearing Jonathan within their own framework. And I think that's exactly why, well, when we get the big moment in this video, Stephen Woodford is surprised about what Jonathan Pageau really thinks about God. And why Jonathan Pageau is very much a non-dual theist. And we're probably going to have to be working on that term for a while now. Now, Woodford will say, now that science has come, we can put away these childish things. It's really okay to eat shellfish. It's really okay to have a blend of different materials in your fabric. It's really okay for a man and a man to have sex together. That's really okay. There's really nothing wrong with that. But again, let's go back to this question of right and wrong, because as Woodford normally said, I don't think right and wrong, there's any ontology. It's always dependent upon the goal. And then Pageau keeps asking, well, what's the big goal in your system? And Woodford never directly answers that point. And there are reasons for that. Because once you state that big point, you get rid of, in a sense, your non-dual materialism that doesn't have a telos built into it. And that, in fact, is in many ways what's beneath the meaning crisis. Now, as navigators, we can use science to deliver the outcomes we desire. But then where do our desires come from? How can we establish hierarchies of desires, especially when desire really is in competition with meaning? And I think, as Jordan Peterson has been pushing pretty hard, meaning trumps desire, and we all sort of believe that to be true. Because in many ways, the whole motivation behind, let's say, affording deconstruction of conservative Christians is for good. For what good? For good of the kindness telos. One of the most interesting aspects of this video I found was Peterson's impact on Woodford. Like I said, he's been doing more videos about Peterson than just about anybody else. I mean, he's continued to do them, and that really surprised me. And so part of me was thinking, you know, I always think about people as pastors would think about people. Am I not the pastor of the IDW, for whatever that means? So, you know, Stephen would be sort of the anti-IDW. And so, well, again, this gets into this whole issue. But he's done so many videos on Peterson. Peterson has quietly colonized him in some pretty significant ways. He has to acknowledge a lot of Peterson's argument. And him coming to Pageau, I think, I think he imagined that Jonathan was sort of a Petersonian surrogate. And he quickly, well, not quickly, but by the middle of the video discovered, oh no, there might be some agreement. There might be a personal relationship between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau in terms of their views of symbolism and their approach to some of this, and even some of their postures with respect to certain issues in society. Yeah, there's some alignment going on there, but when you dig down far enough, Jonathan Pageau is coming at this from a very different place, and those differences are not insignificant. So now remember, Stephen's position is from a non-dual materialism. He is working from below. Stories, metaphorical truths that may not be physically true or scientifically true, afforded past religious individuals and communities an adaptive advantage. Now we should use better tools to assess such things for today. Now again, Pageau quite rightly keeps coming back on him and says, okay, so you've got this metaphorical truth. Tell me on what basis you are assessing whether or not this truth as a story should continue to endure in the culture net, or if it should be taken out and retired, just as ideas about bad air or ideas about porcupines throwing their quills, or maybe my favorite example is Brett Weinstein's example of the Boxing Day tsunami, where you had this one religious minority that lived in houseboats that had a tradition of understanding the spirits that moved the waters. When the waters recede, you'd better get to high ground because, well, the spirits, or however they conceptualized it, angry or hungry or doing what they're doing. And in fact, that religious idea saved that community, while a whole bunch of people of various other religious traditions who have been deeply impacted by secularity and ideas about science and materialism drowned. And so, well, there's an example of an adaptive advantage, because all of the people that believed that the spirits were moving the waters went on to share their genetic material and to a degree, their their culture net material, which has probably been losing pretty significantly to the dominant paradigms in the world. But they all went on to pass on their genetic material to future generations. And so, quite rightly, Jonathan Pageau keeps coming at him. on this, it's incredibly important, but often overlooked with respect to, okay, we're going to evaluate all of these metaphorical truths. Which yardstick will you use to evaluate these? Well, in some ways, we are always evaluating these stories, and part of my argument is that religions are actually always changing and adapting, but built into their systems of many religions, and especially across let's say, the spectrum of Christian traditions, you've got all of these aspects of both adoption and resistance to new ideas. An example would be prior to the Protestant Reformation, it was the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church that lending money at interest was wrong. Now, John Calvin comes along and makes an argument from Scripture that you may lend money at interest if you are lending money not for necessity, but rather for another capitalist endeavor. And here we see the heart of capitalism growing out of theology, because John Calvin adapted the biblical material with an argument and removed a prohibition that had been binding Catholic Europe for quite some time and affording some both positive and negative relationships between Catholics and Jews in Europe. There's just a historical example of, well, religious traditions are adapting all the time. But again, Peterson's impact in Stephen Woodford has been significant, and I think this is part of the reason that he sort of wandered over for a conversation with Pageau. Now, there's a lot of kindness telos smuggling going on here based on Stephen Woodford's non-dual materialism and anthropology. The good just seems self-evident. And again, this is a conclusion that sociologist Christian Smith came to in his massive study of the moral and religious assumptions of American teens in the 1990s, that for many people, morality just appears self-evident. It doesn't seem to be based on anything. They've just absorbed it from their parents and from their culture. And this, of course, is really the great human superpower, that we have all this networking machinery that the lesser evolved, even that word is subject to a lot of telos, that the chimpanzees don't have, that we are these absorbers, and we all absorb these implicit, unconscious first drafts of parenting and partnering and morality. As children, we're just absorbing, and we're always sort of evaluating on and testing and seeing this is exactly what we do. And so we have a very noisy culture net that is always sussing out these things. So the good just seems self-evident because we haven't really explored it. And especially if you haven't lived in other cultures that have very different moral systems. Now, again, pluralism plays in this in very interesting ways. But basically, as Tom Holland is saying, this is just, we sort of get the kindness part of Jesus, that Jesus basically gets reduced to kindness. And you see this all the time. If like me, your part of your life is embedded in religious texts, yes, Jesus was in some ways extraordinarily kind, but other times not kind at all. And C.S. Lewis actually picked this up. He said, kindness is sort of the prevailing morality of our culture. But as is true of hierarchies all the time, if you put kindness at the top, you're demoting other things. And depending on what value you put at the top, that is actually going to impact the other competent or prominent values that you see. And as I've said before, in the American political system, Republicans sort of manifest strength, Democrats sort of manifest kindness. And you see that back and forth. But whether someone chooses strength or kindness and uses to either to justify kindness at the expense of strength, or justify strength at the expense of kindness, that usually involves some kind of justifying story that says, well, in this, and you even see the adaptation in our language, well, this requires tough love. Well, that is sort of justifying strength at the expense of kindness, but we sort of jury-rig the language to say, well, this really is kindness, but in another form. And of course, we're always playing these kind of games. They're not just games, they're all adaptations that we're working. So we afford as much organized liberty to allow individuals to pursue their local goals and desires, because of course, kindness and achieving desires is sort of what the game in our culture is about. Religious systems might have worked in the past, but we know more, like gay sex is harmless and desirable, so it's time to put away these bad old ideas. That's basically the argument and the point I've been making. I don't really think you would have had same-sex marriage or this sort of pride about same-sex sexuality apart from the Christian ethos of kindness. The Romans, yes, it's true, the Romans and the Greeks didn't have the same sorts of stigmas as Christianity had with respect to same-sex behavior, but they had plenty of stigmas which are fairly blind to us. For example, the superior, they weren't egalitarians at all, okay? The superior had the right to penetrate the inferior, and that had to do with male and female, but also same sex. So there was no stigma against penetrating an inferior if you wished to. That was basically the way sex and status worked together. If I say something like that in our culture, say, yeah, you're allowed to go and have gay sex, but if your social credit score is higher than the other, then that impacts the position that you will assume in terms of who is giving pleasure and who is receiving pleasure. All right? So, I mean, these things get complicated. Part of the Christian story simply assumed and is not justified in this. And again, one of the comments on Pageau's copy of this was that it was very interesting. When making this video, I'd often have to go back to YouTube and want to read the comments or go back to the source. Every time I searched for Pageau Rationality rules, I would always get Woodford's video top of the order, and Jonathan's video wouldn't appear on the same page, even though I watch a lot of Jonathan's video. I would have thought it would have given me both copies of them, but it didn't. Is YouTube biased? Let the conspiracy murmur run wild. And then you get the crying game moment of this video, which is really the sort of the aha in the video. And this is how it goes. Now, maybe some of you aren't old enough to remember the crying game and the surprise that the movie rippled through the culture with. And thinking back, it was out in 1992. You never hear this movie mentioned anymore, but it was a big deal, and I think I kind of understand why the movie's not mentioned anymore. But anyway, this was the crying game moment of the video.
Religion is the cancer of archetypes.
Okay, that is a very interesting statement. Religion is the cancer of archetypes. Basically, what Woodford has done, so you've got your non-dual materialism, which comes up from the bottom. So at the bottom, you have this life on its own, the physics going on its own. And then there's basically what he's taken is inserted Jung and Peterson at a lower level. That's where they sort of come into the stack. And what religion does is basically constrains the archetypes and destroys them, because again, in Woodford's mind, religion is this very static system. Now, speaking as a religious person, I would say religion is far from static. The practice of even Dutch Reformed Christianity within my tiny denomination has changed radically from the days when my grandmother was a little girl. I've told this story before. My grandmother in Grand Rapids, Michigan, went to church one day in flesh-colored stockings, and an elder stopped her and said, young women should wear stockings. And this is the beginning of the 20th century. If you look at pictures, you've got, people are wearing stockings or hose, but technology afforded then flesh-colored stockings, and my grandmother, not one to be slow of speech or terribly submissive in some ways, pipes up at the guy and says, I mean, this is a story that was significant enough for her that she told it to me. I have flesh-colored stockings. So there, take that, elder. Religious traditions are always reassessing and interpreting, but they're doing so within their own framework. So the idea that religion sort of nails things down, I think you're better off thinking religion as sort of a drag on selective elements of innovation, but there's always change within.
Because it turns them into something dogmatic that you can't question anymore. I think that's the big problem. And
that you can't question. He's obviously never been in religious traditions. There's people questioning stuff all the time. It's just there's a filter over that makes some things easier to question and some things harder to question. But I would assert that's universal over people. In every culture, there are things easier to question and things harder to question. And anybody who's paying any attention to the dominant conversations in place like YouTube will know that there are some questions which may not be asked because you will get deplatformed. It's not new to religion. It's just how human society works.
And then you also have this issue where you actually have a lot of people that literally believe at least some of the aspects, which is what you have in every religion. Like,
okay, literally believe. That word, literally, should probably go away. You should probably physically believe, or believe in this physical thing, because that's sort of what they're using literally for. And if you look up literally in a dictionary, it'll say the base level. So it's literally really has a lot to do with sort of where it is in the stack. And in terms of this non-dual materialism, well, the physical layer is the location in the stack is the foundational layer in the stack.
You have most people just simply really do believe that a conscious being called God exists, that is looking at who he sleeps with and on what position. You don't have that position. From my understanding, you don't even believe that there is a conscious being called God out there.
Wait. I don't believe that God, it can be limited to being, but I believe that God, I believe that there is something above all categories, and that something is the source of everything, and that it's not something. It's Saint Maximus describes God as being and non-being at the same time, and so there are different ways of describing this absolute. And consciousness is a good way to understand God. It's a good way to understand God because from heaven comes meaning and pattern, and so patterns come from above, and so our capacity to notice patterns and to engage patterns and to produce patterns is let's say culminates in the infinite and culminates into God.
And then they're going to go off. But there's the crying game moment of this video when, well, you don't believe in this. And you will find these moments reliably, especially on Unbelievable. Again, one of my favorite episodes is Richard Dawkins on Unbelievable, and he's having a conversation with a Jewish scholar and a Christian minister, and basically Richard Dawkins says, well, you're not one of the bad Christians out there who believe, and well, why is this? Well, you're a non-dual materialist. This is your stack. And Pageau is a non-dual theist. His stack comes from above. And so this is why in the recent conversations, we all have this emergence, which is from below, and emanation, which is from above. This is why you have all this directionality in these conversations. And Pageau basically says, you know, okay, you have all of these patterns from below. These patterns don't come from below. You haven't in any way accounted for the shape of any of these patterns. You simply say they are. In other words, this physics is sort of your God. Well, my God actually has consciousness, and consciousness is a good way to understand my God. He is not a conscious being in terms of a super thing that is out there in the world. He is not even simply being itself. He is, and again, this, when you start getting into this language with Pageau and others, it gets esoteric very quickly because, well, what do you mean by being? And this is where Jonathan will basically go and say, well, and to put some words in Jonathan's mouth and bring in some Vervaeke thing, and some of my arguments, I would argue that, and I agree with Jonathan where he goes here, is that actually the conceptualization of God as a father or as father is really helpful for human beings, because this is how we are built to relate to the world. And again, going back on my videos, when your car won't start, why do you talk to it? Getting into Pascal, the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry. This is how, in fact, dare I use the words, we are biologically evolved and culture-wise evolved to engage with a world that is too complex for us to manage. We approach it with all of the tools that we have. So that is why we worry about the tiger in the bush, this overactive agency detector that has been argued for. This is why we employ all of this mental, psychological machinery when we approach a world too large for us to understand. You can understand it from below, and you can understand it from above. And this perhaps might be the place in which these two might be able to continue the conversation, because that's, I think actually that's a good way to proceed. So there's the crying game moment. It's when Stephen Woodford has a moment of discovery about Jonathan Pageau. Non-dual materialists, it's easy to assume God is a super thing, because again, well, God, and this is where Jordan sort of expands, okay, God is not a super thing. Now, to use this word that John Vervaeke introduced, God is maybe a hyper thing. And even the conceptualization of that term, a hyper thing, just betrays sort of the non-dual materialist roots of it. It's a hyper thing, but it has to be a thing. Remember the beginning of Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. The world can be conceptualized in two different ways. A place of objects, things are dominant, or form for action. Look at my conversation with the two Michaels. Are we talking nouns or verbs? In many ways, Jonathan Pageau's non-dual theism dominates with verbs. Stephen Woodford's non-dual materialism dominates with nouns. Now, of course, in order to have a sentence, you need nouns and verbs. But how do we get these things two together? And you get Vervaekean's sort of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It makes perfect sense. And that's probably the direction we're all going philosophically and theologically. But that's what we're working in. So now again, you can't blame Stephen Woodford for listening to Christians and take them at their word in terms of their conceptualization of God. This is late-stage Protestant ideas, and post-deism, God sort of becomes a thing. Now, as that recedes, as C.S. Lewis notes, people, when they sort of lose whatever scraps of Christianity, Judaism, or Platonism that's in their philosophical worlds, they'll tend to devolve back into pantheism, which is sort of older style. You've got a meta-divine realm, you've got gods up there, but non-dual materialists, well, now we're going to have ideas functioning instead of gods, and now we're going to have ideologies, but all of those, again, are going to be dependent upon our mental frameworks. Christians have this sort of weird adaptation, if you don't go all the way in Pageau's way, where, well, is God a thing? Is God a being? Well, that's exactly where this conversation went and why it went there. So many Christians immersed in Western Protestantism think likewise. And again, this is that terrific moment in Vancouver 1 where they get to the end of the night and Sam Harris is like, we've never got to the big issue. Well, what's the big issue? Jordan Peterson, what do you think God is? And Jordan Peterson opens his Surface book and starts reading his description. And Sam Harris says, no, that's not God. But again, if you're immersed in enough older theology and you listen to what Jordan Peterson is saying, it's recognizable. And it was, in fact, recognizable to me, who's a Protestant, but based on my formation in documents like the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession, which are reformational materials, but they're pre-deism. Okay, the Canons of Dort comes a little bit later, and so it gets entangled in some more of these ideas. But this is basically where the conflict is. So Stephen Wolfert doesn't have time to assimilate this conversation yet, at least not on the fly. And so it's going to be very interesting if they come back together. They're going to have to get back to this point, because the real difference is there or is there not a super thing? Again, that's how this trope plays out. And Pageau says, no, there is not a super thing. Wait, what? Well, then why do you continue to be, in terms of Jonathan Pageau, an adherent to a very conservative religious tradition? Well, this is hopefully a potential takeaway from this conversation, and I hope they both kind of think this through, and that gets built into the next conversations. Both Christians and atheist conversations don't get this far. So in that sense, this moment alone was really the takeaway from this conversation. Now, this gets into the question of what religion is to Jonathan Pageau. And this is religion W. And now, it's when Jonathan gets talking like this that he loses a lot of people, because he's trying his best to make it clear and less esoteric, but, well, I'll let you decide.
Religions it's not, the word religion is such a complicated word because it tends to separate things. But let's say traditional societies, let's use it that way. Traditional societies had rituals and patterns and stories that would celebrate and participate in this frame of reality that I tried to describe to you.
Sometimes I mess up which button to press. So this is where Pageau's non-dualism comes in, because what's fundamental, the fundamental goal of the human being is to participate in the divine. Okay? Now, again, if we're going to have this conversation between Christians, in many ways, we're going to start tripping over a bunch of what happened in the Protestant Reformation, and perhaps even some differences between East and West. But that's, and to language this stuff gets really hard. But notice where Jonathan Pageau begins here.
And stories that would celebrate and participate in this frame of reality that I tried to describe to you, right? So here's the frame. There's usually in most traditions, even though people don't tend to realize it, but there's an absolute, like something which is above all categorization, which is beyond the basic opposites. I say most religious systems end up having that, even though sometimes they don't talk about it so much. But you have an absolute which is beyond all categorization. You have these opposites, and then you have the world playing itself out within these opposites. And so religious traditional societies, they celebrate that and participate in that through architecture, through how they lay out their buildings, how they organize their societies, their storytelling, their dances, the liturgical year, how they qualify time, how they see themselves as playing out this pattern. And so it.
Okay, so again, this is why the emanation emergence conversation has emerged from the conversation between Pageau and Vervaeke, because emanation comes from above. And so what's happening in the religious traditions is they are working their way up to heaven, okay, as it will. Now, again, you get to something like late stage modern Protestantism, and well, the goal is for the soul to go to heaven. Notice how some of that is in there, but also then notice the Gnostic issues involved. And what Pageau is saying is that this isn't a dualism between, say, matter and spirit. This is the tensions are in there, but it's non-dual theism, but it's coming from above. And all of reality is nested in that. Now, that's a really difficult ask for people who have been soaking in non-dual materialism in many, many ways. But if you think through that psychologically, the fact that the basic orientation is itself an abstract idea, suddenly you have a point for the spiritualists. Okay, what is, oh gosh, this stuff is so hard. What is spirit? Again, go back through all of my videos. What is spirit? Spirit is the thing that moves, the thing that forms, the thing that, again, get into Aristotle, the cause that, the formal cause, the cause that gives form to reality. In other words, the spirit is the thing which gives the laws of nature which gives the laws of nature. That's what spirit does. It gives the laws of nature. Laws are given. Laws are given from above. And the fact that we continue to have this in our language shows the theistic roots even of this non-dual materialism. Because if you ask a non-dual materialist, where do the laws of nature come from? Well, they're just there. Well, were they created? That's where you have the difficulty. And that's where these two are really working from different areas. And it's very difficult for them to find things together. This is religion W. This is the very deep coding and assumptions. And now for us as psychological culture net creatures, these things have been programmed into us at a very early age, and we don't just very quickly think our way in and out of them. They are the assumptions of our culture, and just as Jonathan noted, they are built into our architecture, they are built into our art, they are built into our music, they are built into our politics. From top to bottom, they are built into things. Now, this doesn't give the theist sort of a terrific advantage, because someone would say, hey, wait a minute, hasn't the I'm going to use the other language I use, the closing of the one eye to take all of purpose out of reality, hasn't that afforded economic power, military power, scientific power, technological medicine, all of that? Yeah, strong point. It's part of the reason a lot of people looked at some of these other spiritual emanation systems and other religious texts, and they said, these are outcompeting those. But this is where it's interesting that Jordan Peterson comes in and says, now, wait a minute. There's a lot of legacy code in this that we don't know we can get rid of. So traditional societies see patterns in the world and organize everything from collective to individual to fit into the nested patterns to achieve or fulfill the telos of the great pattern. Christianity, Pageau would say, is the true pattern. That Christianity is true because, as C.S. Lewis said, not because I see the world correctly through it. In Christianity, I can understand my world. Okay? It's the light that illuminates the patterns that lay out and explain the world. That's what Christianity is. Now, of course, Stephen Woodford already has a pattern religion. It's just that it's water for the fish. And he's born into it. And over the course of time, again, look at the Enlightenment, read Voltaire and the philosophes. It's very, very interesting. This is a very old, long conversation. And Woodford would say, ours has outcompeted yours. The germ theory is superior to the bad air theory. Why is it superior? Because I can avoid COVID with a germ theory better than a medievalist with their funny mask can avoid the plague. But now pay attention. Look at the strangeness of these medieval masks. They're working on different levels there. It isn't just air. There's other stuff going around. And again, I really want to dive into C.S. Lewis and Barfield on this at some point. The presumed telos is experiential satisfaction of our desires. See, the difficulty is that as human beings, a telos will always sneak in. We're not going to get away from it. There's always going to be a reason. And again, a non-dual materialist will say, a reason we project onto it. Well, fair enough. But that reason's going to govern. And that reason's going to shape. And again, this is one of Jordan Peterson's arguments, that our culture net is going to shape the physical world. So right there, you have a Pageauian direction of, once human beings are operating in the culture net, in the theory, and we're doing it communally, already we have materiality being colonized by mentality. Okay? And so Pageau's argument keeps coming around because we keep living that way. Because we might say, okay, well, my hormones are telling me to have sex with whatever woman is attractive to me. But society is functioning at this culture net and saying, no, you should deny your desire. Why? Because we have these reasons up here. Well, my gonads aren't listening to those reasons. Oh, but your head should govern your libido. See, in a way, you've already given into the Pageauian emanation, because your head governing the libido is an example of this. And when you construct this broader ought in society, well, we should remove the stigma against same-sex relationships. That's all up here too. It's not down here. So this is the fight that is not going away. And it's better if we can understand some of the directionalities of this fight. This is why those who stand against this pattern by perpetuating non-libertarian moral norms to children, for example, must stop in the mental imaginary of the non-dual materialists who have an implied and implicit telos of kindness, even if it violates the personal satisfaction of the religious person. Again, what you basically say is, here is a group of people it is okay to not be kind to for the sake of these other people that are, in a sense, higher up in the hierarchy. Well, why would this tiny little group of same-sex attracted people, according to a particular imaginary, there's a whole nother conversation in there, why should they have preference over the mass of religious people that are heterosexual by orientation? Why should they be given a privileged position? Well, now we're barking at the door of Christianity once again, because that's been dominating the mental imaginary. And in many ways, the movie ended, the video did end with a bang, with an evangelistic plea by Stefan to Jonathan.
Here's a question for you, okay? Given that we have these mutually exclusive religions, these mutually exclusive motifs.
And what's interesting is these two have mutually exclusive imaginaries with respect to the world. And so, yeah, if you two can find each other, well, that would be something worth watching.
These mutually exclusive patterns of being, unless you want to define them all in something so basic as order and chaos and be vague about it, which is one of the frustrations I have. But if you have all of these religions with these different views and these ideologies with different views, and we recognize that they're not arbitrary, but rather they are a product of, they are a manifestation of our evolutionary psychology, how the hell do we navigate with...
But you see what he did right there? They're a manifestation of our evolutionary psychology. He just grounded them in his non-dual materialism, which, of course, he's going to do. But is that really scientific? Can you really demonstrate that? It's tough.
Which of them are features and which of them are applicable today? Because...
Okay, so again, here we are choosers. And we are choosing in order to afford our desires, but we have already assumed the mental position, and it's been reinforced in us from society, that if we cooperate in maybe limiting some of our desires, we can get more of our desires reached. You're not playing along in this game as you should be. If I can convince you in the mental imaginary, bring you over to my side. But again, all of this is assuming his own worldview. That's you know, that's not a... That's just how we work. And to get beyond it is really, really hard.
The only way I feel like real progress can be made is if you're willing and able to...
Real progress. Progress in terms of what? Progress in terms of whose agenda? Is if you sacrifice your imaginary for mine. It is just as imperialistic. It is just as colonizing. It is... But again, I'm not casting a problem on that. That's how we work in order to be able to cooperate, in order to compete. Oh, come on, YouTube.
One of them, which of them are features and which of them are applicable today? Because the only way I feel like real progress can be made is if you're willing and able to recognize that Christianity isn't the best thing since sliced bread. It's a great thing, and it has. And let me make that clear. I really do think it's a great thing. It has better patterns of being, say, than communism. But
how do we navigate? The problem with what you're saying is, again, the same problem that I mentioned again, is that you tend to think that you can stand outside of this. And then you can say, how do we, like, who are we and where are we standing, that we can decide which patterns, like which religion is better and everything. That's not our experience of reality. Our experience of reality is that we are the product of a story, and we are the product of a world, and we live in a world, and we live in embodied existence. And so the solution to making Christianity better.
Notice where embodied, how late embodied comes in Jonathan Pageau's. Okay, this is emanation from above. Notice, Stephen, this is emergence from below.
Is to be a Christian and to make it better. Like
but
there's no
Christianity.
How do from the outside. Like it's not people that are standing outside and are telling Christians we don't know where they're standing from, and telling them like, here's something you're doing wrong, here's something you're doing right, and we don't even know what their telos is, like what they're aiming at.
Don't start with Christianity. Start with...
But I'm a Christian.
But don't do that, because that's not your identity.
Where should I start from?
The fact that you're an evolved primate, and that you have all of this wiring in your head, this psychological evolution, and you don't know which parts are bugs. So don't have this assumption that Christianity is bug-free. It's not. It's very likely not. Why do we know that? Because no ideology is bug-free.
Now, again, this gets really complicated very quickly. Okay, what parts of Christianity? When John Calvin, for example, rejiggered the Christian teaching on lending money at interest, what was John Calvin doing? Religions do this all the time. So it's just religious systems are different ways of assessing many of the smaller conversations, nested goals within the greater goal. It's just stop doing it, he says to him.
Right. And what scale are you using to judge the bug from? Like, where are you? Like I said,
the same as you. Same as you.
No, because I have a pattern by which I judge, I participate in the world.
You're an evolved primate, right? Correct. Let's go that far.
That's definitely not my first category.
No, it's no,
because I don't have that experience. You have the experience of being an evolved primate.
Okay, our experience would necessarily be that.
Like when you wake up in the morning, you have that experience. Like I have the experience of...
No.
And what's really interesting too, and to bring in some Vervaekian relevance realization, why primate? Aren't there a host of other creatures all the way back to, I haven't blown them up for a while, Mr. Lobster, that are in you as well? What do you mean in me? Well, the wiring is in me. And look at the whole conceptualization. Why are we not evolved lobsters? Why are we not evolved? And I'm by no means an expert in evolution, but why the primates? Because we look like them?
That's a conscious consideration. That's not the same as experience. Like if you want to say, you know, when I wake up and I'm not actually scared of spiders, but you know, you see someone that's scared of spiders, that itself is a testament to their evolutionary psychology.
And what's interesting is, and I don't know, see, this is the thing, we trade in these things without doing the research. Well, is fear of spiders a learned or a or something that's coded in us genetically? Now there's the argument about, you know, you have the cucumber and the cat trick, you have the snake and the chimp trick. Well, why? This is your arguing point?
Psychology. They are an evolved primate on this spinning earth, and everything
on the spinning earth. Again, all of this stuff gets nested in.
That they think they know goes back into this evolutionary psychology, all of it. And so we have to navigate from that starting point, or at least
have to. We have an ought in there. Have to in order to what?
Least a starting point that's way beyond Christianity. The starting point is, if you say that Christianity is a starting point, then I can't. You just. I can't. I will never get through to you because it's the same as.
Well, here's the question: can these two talk? It's going to be interesting. I hope they try again.
Someone that says no, Islam is the primary motif. That's where the starting point is. It's game over.
So let's say you say I am an evolved primate that is on this spinning earth. That, to me, that's a secondary consideration. That's an abstraction. It's an abstraction from knowledge that people have developed and theories that people have developed, and it's something that it's just like people who talk about the solar system. The solar system is a total abstraction. It's an abstraction from an experience.
Forget the Earth thing. I know what you're saying. I'm just trying to express a point.
But it's the same with the evolved primate thing. It's an abstraction.
Well, okay. We'll forget that bit. I just find that I'm conscious and I experience the world around me.
That's good. I like that one.
Okay. And then the next thing I realize is that my consciousness.
You're an evolved primate.
No. Next one will be. I mean, that's just a way of describing it, right? But it's a way of describing this sense, and that is that. You know, I bear the stamp of my lowly origin. The way that you'd put that in simplest terms, I guess.
Lowly? There's no purpose in this. There was no purpose in the lobster in that system to arrive at the primate. Why lowly?
I need more time to put this correctly, but it would be I'm conscious. And the next thing I recognize is that my intuitions are not arbitrary. They come from an evolutionary background, which is why I was saying it. But if you want to get technical,
or they come from my brain, or they come from my environment. I mean, this stuff gets really complex really fast.
That's where the starting point is. So then what we have is these ideologies, these religions, and they're not arbitrary because they are substantiations that have the same substrate, that have these metaphorical truths.
Okay, now we're getting to how Peterson invaded his anthropological stack.
Have these Jungian archetypes and motifs in them, and we have to figure out which of them are bugs, which of them are features, because they can't all be correct, because many of them are mutually exclusive, and then more importantly.
And the difficulty you're going to have is, okay, so let's say your telos is kindness. Your telos is minimizing the conscious suffering for as many people as possible. But even if you articulate it that way, so let's say you have, let's use these numbers. Let's say 5% of your population is determinedly and irrevocably same-sex attractive. 95% of your population is not. Well, if you're basically trying to assess suffering by the number of people, let's say 45% of your population isn't bothered by same-sex behavior, but another 30% of it is. That 30% of it is going to be annoyed by your haranguing them about the sexual predilections of 5% of your population. That doesn't even make any sense. So what's going on in terms of the goal that you have? Well, we can reprogram Oh, you can reprogram that 30% of religious people who are resistant to it? Well, but we have all other goals with these people that we want to reprogram. Okay, but they're trying to reprogram you and you're trying to reprogram them. How are you going to say which programming is better in terms of this is part of the point that Jonathan is making.
We have to figure out whether or not they are applicable to the environments that we're in now, which we simply did not evolve for. We haven't escaped our evolution in its entirety, nowhere near, we never will, okay? We will always bear the lowly stamp of our origin, as Charles Darwin put it. However, it's undeniable that the environments that we have today are vastly different to the environments that we evolved in, and we have to be able to recognize that some of our
and this gets into the point C.S. Lewis makes, both miracles and the abolition of man. We have to. Here's our mission. Where does that come from? It seems that you've established this. Okay, well, name it. The kindness telos. Just give it a name. Let's examine its credentials. Let's see what is rational with respect to that telos. But if you have no dominating telos that you at least have to name, well, and again, kindness, and again, another point that Lewis made, kindness and love are not the same thing. Pageau mentioned, okay, love's at the top of your value hierarchy. Love and kindness, not exactly the same thing.
Intuitions, some of the motifs that are in our intuitions are going to be today chaos where they were yesterday order.
I mean, like I think this is probably where we reach the end of the conversation, because I think that you can't, we are handed something. We are handed a story. We are handed a story from our family, from our nation, from our ancestors, and we live in that story.
And again, I would adapt that and say this is our first draft. Okay, we absorb this first draft. Well, what do I mean by a first draft? Okay, well, if you've ever been married or started a significant romantic relationship and suddenly you didn't even know you were bringing assumptions to the relationship until your romantic partner said, "I'm not your mother," or something like that, saying, where did those assumptions come from? And you have to stop and realize, I just had them. Yeah, but I don't have them. Oh, well, and the story, the narrative, it's all built into us. And so this non-dual materialism versus this non-dual theism, I mean, except Pageau has done a lot of work in terms of developing and re-articulating and refining his story. And that's part of how that cake is baked the way it is. So, and again, Jung and Peterson sort of fit into Stephen Woodford's stack. And I think this is a really helpful video on that, because when I think about many of the people that I've talked to with respect to these ideas, that's exactly what's happened. Peterson has sort of fit into the stack there. And so, well, this is a way that I can sort of keep my non-dual materialism, but the problem is the longer that lives there in the stack, the more you begin to realize that, no, you've got a lot of emanation coming from these other ideas. Maybe not all the way up at the level of God, but you've got a lot of downward emanation, and you're beginning to notice it more and more and more and more. And that's beginning to lend credence to, well, where did the laws of nature come from? Who was the lawgiver? What was behind his giving of these laws? I can't help but use all of this impressive machinery in my mind, this relational machinery that has afforded us this competitive advantage over other primates, to relationalize and conceptualize and do all of this, and very quickly I'm living in this other world. Is there a way forward for these two? Woodford would need to reconsider his assumptions about Pageau's belief. They've had the crying game moment, and when the revelation happened, Jonathan had machinery there that took Stefan by surprise. Understanding the implication is not a small or quick task. And again, I've been listening to Jonathan for about 3 years now. I've had a number of conversations with Jonathan, and we at least start more on the theist side. And, over time, and I'm sure many of you will cheer, I know there's a good number. When's Paul going to become Roman Catholic? When's Paul going to become Orthodox? Jonathan's impacted me, and Jonathan has taught me a tremendous amount. But again, all of that happens with more and more time together and sharing at different levels. And so it's going to take a while for the crying game moment to sort of trickle down through all of the levels. And so, it's a good conversation. But it's frustrating because they both keep repeating each other because they're not connecting at the way we wanted to see them connect with respect to this video. The debate about the super thing is quite pointless because it's not what Pageau believes anyway. Okay, then what do you believe? Well, that's going to be the work involved. It's very difficult to figure out what to talk about without that much common ground. So, what does Stefan want? Well, from the world, he wants change. Religion is the corruption of archetypes. And again, I think it's not a good point, but it's a very common point. No, religions change too. And they're in very interesting conversations with many of these archetypes. All right. Surrender on points that we've already won on. And this is, in a way, the Enlightenment gets its fuel from the totalitarian practices of the medieval and early modern Roman Catholic Church in Europe. And I think most of us cheer the victories of the Enlightenment. At the end of the Council of Dort, the losers lost their lives. I'm involved in regular religious convocations these days. At the end of none of them have the losers of votes lost their lives. That's important. The losers of the Council of Nicaea didn't lose their lives. So one might argue that, well, is this a progressive thing? No, there have been times when they have and times when they haven't. There are many types of human meetings where the losers lose their lives. And so, yeah, we can talk about that. But in terms of American or Canadian or British politics, you already won on the patriarchy and gays. So why the fight continuing? Because you will not rest until it's been banished from all of our thoughts, or at least all of our expressions, or all of our imaginaries. The comment, the red belt, that's sort of Bible Belt meets red state. Now, again, we have a Brit and a Canadian talking here, but it's always amazing to me how much U.S. politics figures into these debates. We didn't debate the Queen. You share a queen. What's the deal? Talk about her. I've been watching The Crown. I've been feasting on royalty stuff lately. It's like, oh boy, where's this going? Derive mission and meaning parasitically. And again, Jonathan, I think one of my favorite videos from Jonathan Pageau is the parasitic storytelling video. I think that video really nicely packaged and summed up a good many of the issues that he's bringing forward. And I thought it was terrifically helpful. And this shows in some ways the weakness of Jordan Peterson's meaning as a gyroscope within the iron box of secularism. That, okay, but a lot of wokesters a lot of people are deriving a lot of meaning by resisting and calling out and denouncing Jordan Peterson. They are. And, well, be careful when you do that, because that's sort of what Woodford was doing, but now he's imbibed a lot of his adversary. It's a very common human dynamic. Same with Christians. So, which is why it's worth talking to one another. So, derives mission and meaning parasitically. You sort of have to keep the opposition around, and you almost always have to inflate them in order to parasitically continue to feed off the mission and the meaning of getting rid of the holdouts. And we see that with, you know, some of the arguments about white supremacists in the United States. We keep hearing people talk about these white supremacists, and it's like, wow, you're really hard pressed. That doesn't, and this isn't to say that racism is gone. Racism will never go away. Bias is simply too common and necessary in terms of our programming, and skin color or other racial attributes are simply too handy that when we're looking for cause to advantage one group against another, racial issues or cultural issues or religious issues or other kinds of tribal issues are almost always at hand. That's simply a function of how human beings compete. So, must not rest until all conscious torment is abolished, except that which is necessary in pursuing our mission. So it's okay to alienate the 40% of religious people in your population for the sake of the 5%. Well, how does that math work? Well, it's obvious, because we're right. Oh, well, I thought we're having a debate over which side is right, not how to annihilate the wrongs. Well, fortunately, we're no longer, or at least not yet, killing people who have the wrong ideas. But we're going to bully them and harangue them and shame them and try and knock them lower onto the social status hierarchies in order to maintain our imaginary. So then again, we're back into top versus bottom. Okay, so what you're telling me is that the culture net, the mental imaginary, the symbolic, liturgical, dramatic imaginary is in fact what shapes everything below, including human beings. Then you've pretty much just given the argument back to Jonathan Pageau. We must keep the opposition alive and all-powerful in order to maintain the meaning of the mission. But then you have the meaning crisis, and this is where Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson all come in. Fundamental meaning crisis doesn't support the meaningful mission. That if you keep digging into non-dual materialism and the purposelessness which you must assert in order to keep all of the subservient mechanisms around, you lose meaning because you've got meaning at too high a place in the stack. You keep digging beneath it in terms of the stack and you lose meaning. And again, meaning eats happiness for lunch. The meaningful mission is borrowed from Christianity. As Christianity recedes, so will its coalition-building power, and the kindness motivation will be undermined. Kindness is the disposable income of the stable, affluent, and secure, until it isn't. And that's the fear, the anxiety that comes up in Tom Holland and Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson. Your kindness is a luxury good, and if the competition gets too high, if in terms of your mental equation, you can no longer afford kindness against your adversaries, and we're seeing this increasing in terms of the communal chatter. No violence is required in order to end racism. Well, what violence do you mean? Silencing, deplatforming, and killing the opposition. Oh. Well, now we're back into a new game. Kindness cannot sustain its place in the hierarchy. What about love? Well, why is it that Jesus tells his followers to love their enemies? That's the only way love stays at the top of the hierarchy. If love only works with some of the people, then there will be something else above it in the hierarchy. But love and kindness are not the same. And we act that out and we play that out all the time. Kindness is an insufficient telos, just like happiness. Even meaning is insufficient. And this is where love and all of the stuff around love comes into the picture. What can prompt sacrifice? Now, usually we sort of rewire this. And this I learned from Tim Keller with respect to a lie. You don't want to be the kind of person who lied. You don't want to be a racist. You don't want to indulge the patriarchy. You don't want, what are you doing? You're using basically status-oriented pride with respect to the group. I'm going to demote you in terms of our group status if you think these ways, make these sounds, encourage these people. You have to sort of get the second class of people out of the system. And in some ways, a lot of that has been what's motivated the anger against Jordan Peterson. It's hard to say Jordan Peterson is a bigot or a misogynist if you look at his life, but he affords aid and comfort to people further right. And this is exactly what came out recently in the employees of Penguin Canada. What was their charge against Peterson? Well, it's a second-order charge. And if you want to purify the culture, you must basically use status hierarchies to demote these people, deplatform these people, delegitimize these people in order to, wait a minute, I thought, yeah, see, it's the same game all over again. But again, it's a mental imaginary game, and you're basically back in Pageau's direction instead of from the bottom. So a second talk. I'm really interested in what they will talk about if they talk again. He's learned that Jonathan Pageau is not a Jordan Peterson surrogate. Jonathan Pageau has an entirely different worldview that he is working from than Jordan. Are there commonalities? Sure. But it's a very different stack coming from Jonathan Pageau. In fact, it's not a stack from the bottom. It's sort of a reverse stack from above because it's emanation, not emergence. Can Jonathan Pageau find quicker ways to explain himself to non-dual materialists and Protestants? Well, in some ways, that's what I've been working on my entire 3 years of my channel, looking for language, testing it out, trying it out. So it's a good, you know, in some ways, this is a good pair because, well, they can try out language on each other, and now they've had their crying game moment, and they've figured a few things out. So I hope they keep talking. Anyway, as with most of my videos, this was entirely too long, entirely too rambly, probably of very little assistance to much of anybody, but it is what it is, and I'm putting it out today. So thanks for watching.